Hey, y'all, I'm Bud Elliott, and this is my college football summer school series on Cover 3. I bring on the team experts from the 24/7 sports staff and ask them the questions I care about. No fluff. Which players will be toughest to replace? What position groups are sneakily better or worse than I realize? We get you the scoop on each team in 20 minutes or less. Let's go. Hey, guys, I'm back with another edition of my college football summer school series. Let's go ahead and talk Duke with Adam Rowe of the Devil's Den. Adam, welcome back to the show, man.
Thanks for having me, Bud.
Absolutely. So it had to be a pretty fun team to cover last year. Played a legitimate top 50, top 45 power ratings level. Won 9 ball games, including a nice win over UCF there in, I guess, the Military Bowl, right? If I'm recalling correctly there. But a great first season for Mike Elko.
Yeah, he outperformed at least my expectations, and I think a lot of other people's too. The team that he inherited from the previous regime had gone 0-9 in the ACC, like 1-18 the previous 2 years, and he put together the first winning record in conference play since 2013 or 2014. Just a really amazing job coaching. That was the reason why he won ACC Coach of the Year, up and down, just kind of turned the program around. There's a lot of excitement going into next year too. They got a lot of guys back from that team, 5th and 6th year guys, and had some success in the transfer portal too.
So Riley Leonard, the quarterback, was a total stud for them last year. Very good through the air. Was also the team's leading rusher if you take out the sacks. Where do you see his game potentially improving as he enters what is probably his final year in Durham?
Yeah, his final year. That's a good point you bring up there. He's getting a lot of NFL draft buzz. This is his true junior year, so he played some as a freshman and then was thrust into the starting role as a sophomore. I think it's just being more comfortable. What they were doing with him in spring practices were kind of calling a group of plays and letting him make the decision at the line of scrimmage. So Kevin Johns is really putting his trust in Leonard to run the offense now. And I think that's the next step in his progression as a quarterback. I mean, he's got all the goods. He can make the throws. Like you said, he can run. I think Brad Crawford mentioned him as the number 8 most dynamic quarterback in all of college football. So yeah, he's a heck of a talent, and his next step is going to be the mental side of the game.
So all of the top pass catchers for this team return. Is there anybody who was not a top guy in 2022 who maybe could crack that top 2 or 3 rotation? Because I mean, right now, like, it doesn't look like there's a lot of room for movement, but maybe there's a young guy who's ready to take that next step.
Yeah, it's gonna be tough. They've got Jalen Calhoun back. I guess Samir Hagans would be the one guy that kind of made some moves towards the end of the season as a slot guy. He's small, but he's real shifty and quick. The other guy that I would kind of keep my eye on is tight end Nicky Damlin, who was hurt for most of the back end of the year, but he is like a true pass catching tight end. Doesn't spend a whole lot of time blocking at the line of scrimmage. And I think they'd love to get him more involved in the passing game. But I would keep my eye on Jordan Moore as the guy to watch this year. He was a quarterback going into fall camp last year until Leonard won the job away from him. So it was his first year playing wide receiver on the college level, and he made some amazing plays.
And really strong hands. Actually led the team in drop rate. So
yeah,
wow.
Yeah, it was really cool to watch him. I mean, up until I think the first week of fall practice, he was taking first team snaps as a QB.
Interestingly here, they do lose 3 of the top 5 on the offensive line by snap count. Now, I know Duke was a team last year that did have some injuries along the offensive line, so I don't know if the snap count accurately reflects like 3 of the top 5 best, but at least 3 of the top 5 guys who played the most are gone. They do take 2 transfers here on the offensive line. How do you see this group rounding out? Because it's pretty obvious, Barton and Monk are going to be in there to stay, I would assume.
Yeah, Barton and Monk are the guys. I think it was pretty interesting watching spring practice. They were playing guys at multiple positions, rotating guys in and out. But I think Jake Hornibrook from the Stanford transfer is going to be kind of one of the guys that's going to get a lot of heavy rotation. They have a lot of optimism about Justin Pickett, who played some last year, but heading into this year is expected to make a much bigger impact. And I think Brian Parker is another guy. Maurice McIntyre is a guy that has really been a starter his whole career at Duke and had a tough injury at the beginning of the year last year, and they're hoping he'll be ready for the start of the season.
Defensively, Mike Elko, you would expect to have pretty good defense. Of course, it was a question preseason with just not really having a great grasp for how much talent Duke had or did not have on the defense. But defensive line-wise, they have to feel pretty healthy. I basically ask you the same question I asked you about receiver with everybody who took 100 snaps returning, and that's like 8 or 9 guys. Is the rotation set? Is there somebody who you expect to kind of go from that backup to starter role or perhaps from starter to star?
Guy keep an eye on for the last question started to start, VJ Anthony. I mean, he started as a true freshman, totally undersized. I think they'd love for him to put on some good weight in the offseason. And then one incoming freshman that they're to keep an eye on is Terry Simmons. Big dude. I think he's like 320. He's got his weight down to around 320. He has not enrolled yet. He'll be in next week, and they're expecting him to kind of compete for some snaps, even though the defensive line is really deep. It's going to be interesting to see what Tyler Santucci does with that group now that he's coming over from Texas A&M.
Absolutely, that'll be an interesting move there. How do you think he impacts that group?
Yeah, I don't know. He was co-DC at Texas A&M last year. I don't know how much he was calling plays. I mean, he's a linebackers guy through and through, so he brings that same kind of skill set coaching linebackers that Rob Smith did. He's just a young, energetic guy on the field. He's one of those guys that you talk to him off the field and he's real quiet and reserved, but then you see him on the field and it's like F-bomb, like this, that, yelling and screaming. So I think he's going to bring kind of some of that energy, and he's hit the recruiting trail running. I mean, he's making an impact on schools across North Carolina. I'm hearing from coaches and players that he's really starting to develop this relationship. So might not pay immediate dividends with this group, but they do have, I would not necessarily say a hole at linebacker, but losing Shaka Hayward is probably the biggest loss from last year's team. So he's going to have to coach up some guys there that might not have been heavy rotation guys last year.
So linebacker, you mentioned the loss of Shaka Hayward. They do return a whole bunch of snaps there, though, from basically everybody else who played any snaps of significance from last year is back. Who's going to take that Hayward role?
Dorian Mayusi, I think, is one of those guys. Him and Trey Freeman are the guys that you can kind of count on to be stalwarts there at that Mike linebacker position. They fortunately got Cam Dillon back as a Columbia transfer last year, who really surprised a lot of the fan base. And myself, we just didn't know a lot about him. But he's a heavy hitter, really can get from sideline to sideline quickly. And he was honored at senior day, walked, and there was some consternation as to whether or not he would come back, and kind of last minute decided, I think the week before spring practice, decided to come back. So he's probably him, and I would expect him and Freeman to be the starters. And Mayusi, who you can see played a lot of snaps, is going to be there. That's kind of the third guy. But beyond that, there's a lot of untested, unproven guys.
You mentioned that they took the transfer there from the Ivy League. Is Duke a team that is struggling to get transfers in academically? I know we've talked to Virginia, at Stanford, Northwestern. A lot of those schools probably would take more transfers if they could, but just academics-wise, it's a hard fit, especially at some positions, it seems. Are there spots on this roster where Duke would have wanted to add a transfer but just was not able to find one that fit?
Yeah, they actually brought in 3 offensive lineman transfers that have since transferred out.
Already this year?
They already transferred out. Yeah. Dan Volpe is a guy that came in. He transferred up from FCS. He didn't even get through spring practice. Yeah. Dustin Hall from UCF made it through spring practice and then transferred to Maryland, I believe. And then they had one other guy come in and his name is escaping me right now, but yeah, he left right after spring practice. So they're looking for some other guys at OL to potentially bring in late in the transfer portal cycle. They're also talking to some linebackers to fill in that depth role, and then safety as well. They're looking for another guy at safety. And I think what you spoke to academics wise is making things a little bit more challenging for them. It's hard to be an undergraduate transfer at Duke. The most success that they've had with guys have been graduate transfers, and a lot of Ivy League guys. So they're bringing in a lot of Ivy League guys now who are going to come in as walk-ons, get a chance to have a master's degree, and hopefully they can produce, but no guarantees.
For sure. You mentioned maybe looking for another safety. They do lose Darius Joyner in the secondary. They lost Datron Young. Mm-hmm. Does that group take a step back, you think, or can it be status quo with those two losses?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, Brandon Johnson was one of the best defensive backs in the ACC last year. They used him all over the field. So I think he's expected to step into that Darius Joyner role from his nickel spot. And then they brought in two transfers, a 7th-year guy from Texas A&M, Miles Jones, a 6th-year guy from Miami, and Al Blades Jr. Those are two guys that have a lot of pedigree, have a lot of good football behind them, but maybe have been injured for a couple years. And they're hoping that they can kind of hit the jackpot with them and find some diamonds there that once they get over their injuries, they can really – step in. I would expect if those guys are going to play big roles, you're looking at Chandler Rivers, who's one of the best freshman cornerbacks in the ACC in the country, who's not going to give up his role lightly. And then there's one other guy. I think his name is Pickett, Joshua Pickett. I always confuse Justin and Joshua. So he's not giving up his role lightly either. So I think they're going to have to try to be creative with those guys because, you're probably looking at those are like the 5 best defensive backs in the roster. So maybe they'll slide some guys over to safety. And Isaiah Fisher-Smith is expected to be a big player at safety as well.
I assume by the answer we talked about just a minute ago with the offensive line and the fact they're looking for more transfers that that's where we're going to go. But what's the spot on this team with the largest drop-off other than quarterback between your starters and your backups? When you're out there at practice, you're like, all right, maybe those guys will be good one day, but these backups really are not people that could have success if they're thrust into game roles.
Yeah, linebacker is probably the biggest. Tight end is another. I think when Damelin went out last year, they had a lot of trouble integrating their tight ends into the offense. And they don't really have a game changer coming in via the recruiting or the transfer portal. So, I think it's a pretty far drop off from him. Keeping him healthy is going to be a really, really, really important piece. I don't know. That's a really good question. The OL depth is not great. I think they would love to add another couple guys there in the transfer portal. I think those are the biggest because, like you said, they've got every skill position player back, every wide receiver, every running back. They actually moved one of their running backs to safety who played really well last year, Terry Moore. So they've got a lot of depth on the offensive side of the ball besides tight end. Linebacker, potentially safety. We'll see how those guys shake out.
It'll be pretty important for them to get off to a fast start. Obviously, they open with Clemson, if Clemson's not improved, Duke could beat them. If Garrett Riley has them cooking from game one, then that's probably a little tougher task for Duke. But Lafayette, Northwestern, Connecticut, they'll be favored in all 3 of those ball games. And if you get off to that 3-1 start, you have to feel pretty good. But they definitely get the bad draw here in terms of it's almost the anti-Louisville. I don't know if you've seen Louisville's ACC schedule, but it's like where's the rest of this, right?
Right.
With Duke, you get Virginia, which I think should be terrible again. You don't get Vatech. You don't get Cuse. There's no Boston College.
Boston College,
right? Yeah. This is kind
of those. None of those bottom half of the ACC teams are on the schedule, really. And then you pull in Notre Dame as on the rotation.
The back half of this, from basically the last day in September to the end of the season, is pretty challenging. They're going to need to get off to that good start. Adam, I really appreciate the time. I'll get you out of here on this. If they lined up and played, does this year's team beat last year's team? Like, do you think this is a better team than last year?
Absolutely. 100%.
Okay.
Just because so many people back.
Yeah.
I mean, they were learning an offensive system for the first time. They were learning how to work under this head coach for the first time. They know all that now. Now it's adding on, getting into the deeper pages of the playbook, really perfecting their craft. And I think this coaching staff has the chops to do it.
Awesome, man. Really appreciate it. Adam Rowe, Devil's Den. Guys, check them out. The awesome Duke coverage they do, and we'll be watching you guys throughout the season.
Thanks, bud.